The year was 1869 when Henry George, then a young journalist, came from California to New York. He was in New York on business trying to get telegraph service for the small paper he worked for. That effort was a failure, but while he was in New York, he was struck by the extreme contrast between the immense wealth he could see in that city, somewhere over there, and the abject poverty literally side by side with it. This clarified in his mind the nature of what could be called the poverty problem, namely, how is it that poverty persists and even deepens as civilizations get better and better able to produce wealth? This was the problem he was mulling over in his mind when he returned to California.
It was in California, in the hills outside San Francisco, that George had his central insight, about 5 years after the end of the Civil War and about a year after the completion of the Transcontinental Railroad. The country was still in the throes of the Panic and Depression of 1869. George had gone out riding, and years later remembered the moment this way. Absorbed in my own thoughts, I had driven the horse into the hills until he panted. Stopping for breath, I asked a passing teamster, for want of anything better to say, what land was worth there. He pointed to some cows grazing so far off that they looked like mice, and said, "I don't know exactly, but there is a man over there who will sell some land for $1,000 an acre," which in those days was a huge sum. Like a flash, it came upon me that there was the reason for advancing poverty with advancing wealth. With the growth of population, land grows in value, and the men who work it must pay more for the privilege. I turned away amidst quiet thought to the perception that then came to me and has been with me ever since. That's probably an understatement. In the years following that insight, George worked out in his head and in a number of writings a comprehensive understanding of the workings of the world in its economic aspect. George was only a locally known journalist before the insight, but afterward he became a household name around the world. His books sold in the millions of copies. His admirers included Leo Tolstoy, the Chinese statesman Sun Yat-sen, Albert Einstein, the young George Bernard Shaw, the young Clarence Darrow, the young Winston Churchill, though Shaw and Darrow and Churchill did turn away from George's thinking later in their careers. George remained widely known until well into the first half of the 20th century, though he is largely unknown in the general population today. All of George's thinking and public speaking is centered around his core insight, namely that private property in land, giving rise to private land monopoly, is the injustice at the heart of the poverty problem. As civilizations advance in wealth-producing power, for example through technological improvement, or the growth of population in areas that are not yet settled, or education, the owners of large or otherwise hugely valuable tracts of land reap the benefit at the expense of the general public. Following this recording, I'll mention highlights of George's thinking, including some interesting corollaries to his central insight. If you read him, you may find, in addition to his eloquence as a writer, that you can no longer accept as valid many of the tenets of conventional economics. But now, it's on to the highlights of George's thinking.
Hello again. Around the time that George came to New York City and stumbled on the formulation of the poverty problem, he still believed in the conventional thinking that wages come from a fixed fund of capital set aside for their payment, as a lot of the world believed and still believes. That worldview posits that laborers are basically pitted against one another because that's just the way the economy works. But his insight outside of San Francisco started him thinking. He knew there was something crucial about the rise in land value. That notion inspired him over the next 9 years to clarify the import of that insight. The main points he arrived at during that period and developed for the rest of his life were these. He understood and clarified how wealth is produced, and particularly the roles of land, labor, and capital in the production of wealth. Land being the natural world before acted upon by human beings, labor being the action of human beings, either moving, altering, or combining the products of nature so to fit them better for the satisfaction of human desires, and capital being a species of wealth produced by labor that is not immediately consumed or used to satisfy human desires, but rather set aside for the production of more wealth. George, in particular, more than any other writer that I've encountered, clearly defined the basic terms of economics: land, labor, and capital, and also wealth being essentially the core subject of economics. Wealth, George defined as the products of nature that have been so moved, combined, altered, or the like, so as to fit them for the satisfaction of human desires. He also had this insight that wealth production in societies is powerfully enhanced by spontaneous or unconscious cooperation of people, even more so than the division of labor. I recommend, for a very eloquent account of that, section of his book that came out at the end of his life, or actually slightly after, because he didn't quite finish it, The Science of Political Economy, where he describes, again, kind of stirringly, the building of a first-class sailing ship and how people come from all points of the compass, having chosen different walks of life, whichever seems to fit better their possibility of living well. Some grow the cotton for sails, some work the sails up into sailcloth, others specialize in carpentry or mechanics and fabrication of things like compasses and so forth. And nobody tells them to do this in a civilization that is in any stage of development that is advanced enough. These things will be produced spontaneously and be available. George makes the point that in a civilization not ready for it, you could not produce works like that. And so much the more true, or just as true, is it today. Consider cell phones or any other technology you like, cyclotrons and so on. Another thing that could be said is that there are a number of corollaries, as I mentioned, that flow from these central ideas of George. One being that the idea that wages are limited and come from a fund of capital that is fixed in extent at any given time in a given society, George showed to be a fallacy because of his understanding of how wealth is actually produced. Wealth does not come, it may seem to come from a fund of capital because often the wages to employees are paid out of a salary fund that is set aside, but actually the ultimate source of it is labor itself acting on land. And so what derives from that is that the world is not, as was then and continues to be widely believed, inherently dog eat dog. That's a tremendous corollary from George's clear-headed thinking about the production of wealth. Similarly, George demonstrated that overpopulation is not an explanation for the increase of poverty with the increase of wealth-producing power, as had been believed and is often still believed fairly widely today. Back in the day, this was known as Malthusianism, after Thomas Malthus, a cleric of the 18th century. who posited that by the operation of nature, by the nature of nature, human population must increase faster than the ability of nature, for example, agriculture, to support it. And there was a sort of complementary theory, the theory of diminishing returns in agriculture. George showed that these, like the wages fund theory about the fixed fund of capital being the source of wages, are also fallacious. Nature is not to blame, but rather the human institution of private property and land, in other words, private land monopoly. Another corollary of George's thinking that flows directly from these observations and insights of his is that the problem with poverty is not a problem of production, of the inability of advancing civilizations to produce wealth, but rather one of distribution, or to put it another way, the perversion of just distribution. As George clarified, because of his clear definitions of basic terms of economics, rent is the return to land ownership of the wealth that is produced in a society. Wages are that portion of wealth produced in society that go to laborers, and interest flows as a return to the deployment of capital. And so the problem is not that civilizations that are advanced cannot produce wealth, as had been sometimes suggested and is still suggested. The problem is one of how wealth is distributed. So this all leads to the greatest corollary of his basic thinking, which is essentially the solution to the poverty problem. The base level of wages is forced to the starvation point as civilizations advance in wealth-producing power, because rent taken by private monopolists then increases, and the increase is accelerated by land speculation. It takes up more and more of the share of wealth that is produced. Another corollary to George's thinking is that the defects in socialism, and as well as what is called capitalism, become apparent. Both the political left and the political right are shown by George's thinking to be defective and also to have their strengths. Socialism, he makes clear, confuses the role of land in the production of wealth with a fuzzy, at best, definition of capital, and also kills by its proposals the spontaneous cooperation and therefore enterprise of wealth production in a society by over-directing it while fostering totalitarianism. On the capitalism side, what is called free market, the so-called free market, cannot be free where it is corrupted by monopolism. The virtues of socialism are that at least it recognizes that there is a problem with poverty and would seek to solve it by doing something to improve the distribution of wealth. The virtue of capitalism being that people ought by right to be able to own the products of their labor and reap the benefits of free enterprise or their own enterprise. And finally, as a corollary to all of George's thinking on these matters, there is the remedy he proposes, essentially to make land, as it was historically ages ago, common property, not subject to private property or private monopoly. The mechanism that George proposed was the single tax on land value. Society and not individual monopolists collect the economic rent. That's why Georgists in his day and even today are sometimes known as single taxers. So this has been a short summary. For example, my dad, the late Dave Sklar, taught the Progress in Poverty course for 17 years at the Henry George School in New York City as a 10-session course. But if you want detail, because a summary can only do so much, I recommend that you read Progress in Poverty, first and foremost, but also other of George's major works that have a lot to offer, such as social problems, protection or free trade, and the science of political economy. I recommend reading them in the unabridged versions so you get the full benefit of George's language and thinking. But that's what I have to say by way of summary, and thanks for watching. Cheers.